Today's sermon and the sermonette I've entitled Tradition. Today's sermon will involve traditions. So the two of them, because I talked to the author of the sermon as well, are going to tie together at least to a certain extent. And I hope you'll be able to see the two. The word tradition, what do we think of when we think of the word tradition? Well, there are lots of different traditions to think about. It's really a broadly based word. We have things that we might, for lack of a better word, might say, we might call secular traditions. I don't know that that's really appropriate because secular is kind of contrasted with religious, and so these are not necessarily pro or anti-religious when I say secular traditions, but we have traditions that are a little bit apart from really either. We will be in another week observing a tradition in this country when we keep Labor Day weekend. It's not religious in nature at all, as far as I know, but it is a tradition which most of the people in this country observe. Maybe some of them observe it as a celebration of the labor movement in the country. The rest of them just observe it as a time to have a good, to rest, relax, go do things, and have a good time. It's traditional in that way. Bible, though, uses the word tradition in a very different kind of a way. And we'll be looking a little bit at how the Bible speaks in the way of tradition. Here's a question. Feast of Tabernacles. Is that a tradition? You say of the elders, because I'll indicate to you before we get through here the sermonette that the Bible speaks of tradition often in terms of the elders, the tradition of the elders. It has a source, a beginning point from where these traditions originated. So we'll be looking at that. Is the Feast of Tabernacles a tradition? I guess we'd have to say it's a tradition, wouldn't we? Because it certainly conforms to what the elders had taught the people in the temple at the days of Christ. And what we see in the Bible is, though, it's more than a tradition. We can say it is a tradition, and it is a tradition, but it's more than a tradition in that it is part of the commandments of God. But there are certain things that are only traditional about observing the Feast of Tabernacles. We're thinking in terms now as we approach the Feast of Tabernacles, we're looking at that and thinking about it in that regard. They had it, you find in John chapter 8, they had a water pouring ceremony. And that doesn't seem to be commanded anywhere. You see it exemplified in John chapter 8, though, and you see Christ standing up at that water pouring ceremony and saying, "Whosoever will, let him come unto me and drink." He's kind of putting a seal of approval on that when he says that, isn't he? But it was part of the traditions that were occurring in the temple. But not all traditions. The Bible doesn't speak positively about all traditions. Here's an example. It's what Christ had to say to the Pharisees. The context was Matthew chapter 15. The context was that they said, "Why do you eat without washing your hands in the way that the elders," tradition, elders had written and taught that the people ought to do, and it was not just because the hands were dirty, but it was a ritual which they had invoked on the people there that they needed to do in addition to just having their hands clean. In verse 3 of Matthew chapter 15, because they came in and said, your disciples are eating without following the traditions of the elders as far as washing their hands go. He said, you know what? It's kind of paraphrasing it. You know what? If you think that's something, why do you then transgress the commandment of God with your traditions? Whoa. Whoa. Can traditions, here's the question, can traditions transgress the commandments of God? We'd all know it's not appropriate for them to do that, wouldn't we? Not appropriate for them to transgress the commandments of God. So, at least we would say here that traditions are not something that can be without consideration as to their correctness. We at least would say that. And Christ goes on to give several examples about the fact that and showing where they were transgressing the commandments of God with their traditions. I guess we would see many of the things in other Christian denominations which transgress the commandments of God, wouldn't we? We would see the holidays that they observe, Christmas, Easter, those are transgressing the commandments of God. They worship on Sunday instead of on the Sabbath. Those transgress the commandments of God. Nothing is appropriate in terms of tradition. At least this we would see from what Christ had to say. Nothing is appropriate that in terms of tradition that is not in accordance with the law of God. So that's a filter over which all traditions should pass, or through which all traditions should pass. But everything in the Bible about tradition is not negative in that way. Paul had some things to say about tradition that were really, really positive. So we have to start thinking in terms of, well, okay, maybe some traditions are negative and some traditions are positive. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it's only a 3-chapter book. Paul says to the church in Thessalonica, therefore, brethren, and I won't go into the context of what he's talking about there, but he says, therefore, brethren. And therefore, obviously relates to what has come in front of what he is now saying. He's drawing a conclusion from what he has just previously said. Therefore, brethren, stand fast. Hold the traditions. Hold on to those traditions which you have been taught, whether by word or by our epistle. Well, Paul is saying some of the traditions, and he's writing to the church in Thessalonica, are positive and ought to be observed. The word here for tradition is the word paradisos. P-A-R-A-D-O-S-I-S. Paradisos. It means a precept, And according to Strong's Concordance, it specifically means the Jewish traditionary law, ordinance, or tradition. Christ said, there are parts of it for sure that you use to transgress the law of God. Here, Paul, who was taught for 3.5 years by Christ, says, hold the traditions which you have been taught. And that means hold to the Jewish traditionary law, the ordinances, and those traditions, provided they pass the pass muster, we might say, as they should be. So there's two sides to this coin. One side is law or tradition, which is not in accordance with God's law. The other side is tradition, which would be in accordance with God's law, and which was taught. And we might look at the water pouring ceremony for example, as an example of that tradition which was in accordance with the law of God and which Christ put his seal of approval on. I don't think you'll find that called out anywhere in the Bible as something that needs to be done. You can look all the way through Leviticus 23. I don't think you're going to find, say, pour water out on the 7th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. How did they get that? They got it from traditions. So how do you know the difference? How do we know whether or not we should observe a tradition or whether we should not? Well, one of the most important things, of course, is to know the Word of God and to take everything that is traditional and look at it in the context of God's law and ask the question, is this in accordance with God's law? Matthew 23, a pair of 23s here. I'd like to try and remember this particular verse of Scripture by 23:23. Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. I think of it maybe in relationship a little bit to double nickels. That was the speed limit. 55, you could go 55. A 5 and a 5. Well, here's a 23 and a 23. Almost 5 times a 5. But anyway, Christ spoke to the Pharisees, if that helps you to remember this particular verse of Scripture. It's a very important verse of Scripture, and it relates very much to what we're talking about here. It says there, and he was in a confrontation with the Pharisees when he said this. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, he says, you are hypocrites. You pay, he said, you're measuring in the minors here. That's one way to put it. You focus your entire attention on matters which are minor and ignore the matters which are major. Now, this is going a little bit in a different direction, but nevertheless, I think the principle remains the same. You pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, the little things, and omit the weightier matters of the law. What we need to do is be sure these traditions are in accordance with the weightier matters of the law. And what are the weightier matters of the law according to Christ in this Scripture? The 3 weightier matters of the law. And guess which one he lists first? Judgment. Judgment, mercy, and faith. Traditions, we have to look at them in accordance with God's law, and then in the overall purpose for which God is doing things and how he is doing it, and we have to make a judgment about whether or not those traditions are appropriate. Judgment is the weightier matter of the law in this regard. So as we look at the concept of traditions in the sermon, I'd like to keep in mind that some traditions are good, others are not. I don't think I'm going to be teaching you any tradition. I will be teaching you some things which are traditions. But I'd like to have you think about this as you listen to them. Keep in mind, some things are good, others are not. I don't expect that anything I'm teaching you is not, but maybe the principle of judgment in relationship to traditions will be something for you to incorporate as well. Here's the basis, number one, for making that judgment. Whether or not it transgresses the law of God. Judgment number two is about priorities. So look at it and see about the priorities that it's painting for us. So let's look at tradition in this light and be sure that as we continue to study in our lives, we separate those which are valid from those which are invalid.